September 12th, 1945. Camp Livingston, Louisiana. The sun hung low over the pine trees, casting long shadows across the dirt compound. The air smelled of pine sap and distant rain. And in the center of it all, 24-year-old Japanese nurse Machiko Tanaka stood frozen, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. A man, an American man, 6 feet 3 inches of impossible reality. His name was Buck Harrison, though Machiko would not learn this for another week. What she saw in that moment was simply a cowboy, a living, breathing cowboy. The kind she had been told existed only in Hollywood fantasies and propaganda meant to fool the gullible. Wide-brimmed hat, denim shirt rolled to the elbows, boots that struck the gravel like thunder with each step, and muscles. Dear God, the muscles. Buck Harrison reached down and wrapped his fingers around a wooden supply crate, the kind that required 3 men to lift. The kind that Japanese soldiers had struggled with even when they were well-fed and strong. He lifted it with one arm, as if it weighed nothing more than a basket of flowers, as if physics itself bent to his will. Then he saw her, their eyes met across the compound yard, brown eyes meeting dark brown, enemy meeting enemy, except his eyes held no hatred, no anger, no triumph, just kindness, a flicker of recognition that she was human, that she was there. Buck Harrison tipped his hat to her, a simple gesture, a motion so casual, so automatic that he probably performed it a dozen times a day without thinking. But to Machiko Tanaka, standing in the Louisiana dust, with her world already crumbling around her, that tip of a cowboy hat was a weapon more devastating than any bomb that had fallen on her homeland. Because in that moment, everything she had been taught for 20 years shattered like glass. The memories came flooding back unbidden. Tokyo, 1943, winter. The classroom cold despite the pressed bodies of 30 young women sitting shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden benches. Machiko had been 21 then, still innocent, still believing. The instructor, a stern-faced man with military bearing and eyes like flint, stood before a map of the world. America glowed in red markings labeled with characters that spelled out weakness, decay, corruption. American men, the instructor had said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, are soft, mongrelized, a mixing of inferior races that has left them incapable of true struggle, true sacrifice, true strength. The young women had nodded, taking notes in careful script. Machiko had written every word. They are fed on luxury and greed, the instructor continued. They cannot work with their hands. They cannot endure hardship. They are creatures of decadence, raised in a nation that values profit over honor, comfort over duty. Someone had raised a hand. But Sensei, what about the Cowboys? The films show them as strong. The instructor had laughed, a cold sound. Propaganda, Hollywood inventions. No such men exist. The Americans create fantasies to hide their weakness. In reality, they are clerks, soft-bellied bureaucrats who would collapse at the first sign of real labor. Machiko had believed him. Why would she not? He was an instructor. The government had sent him. The government would not lie. 3 years later, standing in Louisiana dust, Machiko watched Buck Harrison load that truck. Watched him lift another crate, and another. Watched him laugh with the other guards, his voice deep and easy. Watched him move with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his own strength because he had never needed to. She turned to the woman beside her. Lieutenant Chio Saito, 29 years old, a translator who had studied at Columbia University before the war. A woman who had seen America once briefly in peacetime. A woman whose face now held an expression Machiko recognized because she felt it in her own chest. Terror. Not the terror of violence, the terror of realizing you have been lied to, completely, systematically, about everything. Lieutenant, Machiko whispered in Japanese. That man, he just... I know, Chio's voice was barely audible. I saw. But they told us... I know what they told us, Machiko. Around them, other women stood in similar states of shock. 63 of them total. Nurses, clerks, administrators. A few officers' wives who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Manila fell. All of them captured. All of them transported across an ocean to a land they had been taught to fear and despise. All of them now confronting the fact that propaganda was just that. Propaganda. Major Hatsuko Demoto stood slightly apart from the group, 35 years old, a widow. Her husband had died at Guadalcanal. She had joined the military medical corps afterward, driven by grief and duty. Now she stood ramrod straight, her military bearing intact, but her eyes tracked Buck Harrison's movements with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "This changes nothing," she said quietly, though no one had asked. "One strong American does not mean—" She did not finish the sentence, because at that moment a truck rumbled through the gates, and out of it stepped not one cowboy, but five. Five tall, broad-shouldered men in denim and boots. Five men who began unloading supplies with an ease that made mockery of everything the Japanese Empire had taught its citizens about American weakness. And then the lumberjacks arrived. Later, Machiko would learn they were brothers, Jake and Tom Morrison from Oregon. But in that first moment, they were simply giants, 6 feet 4 inches each, 240 pounds of muscle and bone wrapped in plaid shirts and worn jeans. They carried axes slung over their shoulders like samurai carried swords. They nodded to the guards, called out greetings in voices that rumbled like distant thunder, walked past the fence where the Japanese women stood watching, and one of them, Jake, glanced over and smiled. Just smiled. A friendly, open smile that said he saw them not as enemies, but as human beings. Machiko felt something crack in her chest. "We need to talk," Major Demoto said suddenly. "All of us. Tonight. In the barracks." The women understood. This was not a request. This was an order from a superior officer. But more than that, it was a lifeline. A chance to process what they were seeing, to make sense of the impossible. But first they had to get through the day. The guards led them toward the mess hall. It was late afternoon, nearly dinner time. The women filed in silent, each lost in her own thoughts. The mess hall was clean, too clean, tables arranged in neat rows, windows that actually let in light, floors that had been mopped that morning. Everything about it spoke of organization, efficiency, resources. Everything about it contradicted what they had been told to expect. And then the food arrived. Machiko stared at her plate, stared at it for so long that the steam rising from the mashed potatoes began to dissipate into the air. Beside the potatoes sat a piece of roasted chicken, the skin still glistening with fat, green beans with butter, a roll, real bread soft and white, and a glass of milk. Not a small cup, a full glass, cold, condensation forming on the outside. Her hands shook as she reached for the fork. Around her, the other women sat in similar poses of disbelief. A few had tears running down their faces, not tears of gratitude, tears of rage. Because this plate of food, this simple dinner that the American guards probably considered unremarkable, would have fed her entire family for 3 days back home. "Do not eat it," someone whispered in Japanese. Machiko looked up. It was a young woman named Keiko, 19 years old, a clerk from Osaka. Her face was pale but determined. "This is a trick," Keiko continued. "They want to make us soft, weak, dependent. We must refuse." Major Demoto set down her fork carefully. "We have been ordered to maintain our health. Starving ourselves serves no purpose." "It serves our honor," Keiko shot back. "I will not become like them." Become like them. The words hung in the air. Machiko looked at her plate again, looked at the chicken. In Tokyo and Osaka and every city across Japan, people were eating rice mixed with sawdust to stretch their rations. Children were developing rickets from malnutrition. And here in an enemy prison camp, she was being offered chicken and milk. What did that mean? She picked up the fork, cut a small piece of chicken, raised it to her mouth. It was warm, tender, seasoned with salt and pepper, and something else she could not identify. Herbs, maybe. She chewed slowly, swallowed. It was the best thing she had eaten in 4 years. Across from her, Lieutenant Chio Saito began to cry. Not loudly, just silent tears running down her face as she ate her own dinner. When she noticed Machiko watching, she said, "I studied in America, in New York, before the war. I ate in their cafeterias, their restaurants, and I have spent 4 years telling myself that my memories were wrong, that America was not as prosperous as I remembered, that the propaganda was true. And now," Machiko asked quietly, "now I know I have been lying to myself." Chio took a drink of milk. "This is just Tuesday for them, Machiko. This is just Tuesday." The words settled over the table like a shroud. That night in the barracks, Major Demoto called the meeting she had promised. The women gathered in a circle on their bunks, clean bunks, with actual mattresses, with sheets that smelled of soap. Even the barracks were better than what they had left behind. "We need to discuss what we saw today," Demoto began. She held herself with military precision, but there was something fragile in her eyes, something that suggested she too was struggling. "The men," someone said, "the cowboys, the lumberjacks, they were real," Chio finished. "They were real." But how? The question came from a woman named Ayumi, a nurse like Machiko. "How can they be so strong, so healthy?" "We were told. We were told lies." Demoto's voice was flat, final. "The question is not what we were told. The question is, what do we do now that we know the truth?" Silence filled the barracks. Outside, crickets sang in the Louisiana night. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew. The sounds of America. Normal, peaceful, abundant. Machiko spoke into the quiet. "I do not know what we do, but I know what I felt today, when that cowboy lifted that crate, when he tipped his hat to me." She paused, searching for words. "I felt small, not as a woman, not as a Japanese. I felt small as someone who has believed in something false, who has built my entire understanding of the world on sand." "We all feel that way," Demoto said softly, "but we are still Japanese. We still have our duty, our honor." "What honor?" The words burst from Keiko with unexpected vehemence. "What honor is there in starving ourselves to prove a point to men who clearly do not starve? What honor in refusing to see what is in front of our faces?" "Careful," Demoto warned. "Such talk borders on what truth?" Keiko stood up. "I am 19 years old. I have spent my entire adult life being told that America was weak, that we would crush them, that our spirit was superior to their material wealth. And today I watched a man lift 300 pounds with one hand while laughing about baseball. Tell me, Major, tell me honestly, how were we ever supposed to win this war?" No one answered, because they all knew. They had all done the math in their heads, had compared their memories of rationed rice and propaganda speeches to the reality of chicken dinners and cowboy hats, had understood finally what it meant that America had fought them while simultaneously fighting in Europe, while simultaneously feeding its prisoners full meals, while simultaneously building enough ships and planes and tanks to darken the skies. The Empire had picked a fight with a giant and called it a mouse. Machiko lay awake long after the meeting ended, long after the other women had fallen into restless sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Buck Harrison, about the casual way he had tipped his hat, the easy strength in his movements, the kindness in his eyes. In her pocket, she carried an apple. He had given it to her that afternoon. Just walked up to the fence and handed it through. "You look hungry, ma'am," he had said in English that she barely understood. "Here." She had taken it reflexively, and now it sat in her pocket like a grenade. Because if she ate it, she would have to admit something. She would have to admit that the enemy had been more generous to her in captivity than her own government had been in freedom. She would have to admit that everything had been a lie. 3 days, she told herself. 3 days, and she would decide. 3 days to observe, to learn, to understand. But what Machiko did not know, what none of them knew, was that this was only the beginning. The cowboys were just the first shock. The food was just the opening salvo. Because America, in its infinite abundance and terrible kindness, was about to teach them lessons that would reshape not just their lives, but the entire future of their nation. Tomorrow, the lumberjacks would demonstrate their craft, would fell a pine tree in minutes while laughing about weekend plans, would show them what real American labor looked like. Next week, more food would arrive. Better food. Sunday dinners and Thanksgiving preparations. Fried chicken that would make grown women weep. Bacon that would smell like prophecy. And eventually, quietly, almost imperceptibly, these 63 Japanese women would stop being prisoners and start being students. Would stop seeing cowboys and start seeing teachers. Would stop mourning the war they lost and start planning the peace they would build. But on that first night, lying in clean sheets in Louisiana darkness, Machiko Tanaka simply held an apple in her hand and wondered if eating it would be betrayal or breakthrough. Outside, Buck Harrison finished his shift and headed home to his small ranch. He thought briefly about the Japanese women, about the one who had looked so shocked when he tipped his hat. He hoped they would be okay, hoped they would eat their dinners and get some rest. Hoped that maybe, just maybe, they would start to understand that Americans were not monsters, just people, cowboys and farmers, lumberjacks and guards, men who worked hard and tipped their hats to ladies and fed their prisoners chicken on Tuesdays. Just America. The moon rose over Camp Livingston. The guards changed shifts. The cricket song continued. And in the barracks, 63 women who had believed in myths began the slow, painful, necessary process of learning to believe in something new, something real, something that would change everything. Day 4 arrived with the smell of bacon. Machiko woke to it. The scent drifted through the barracks windows like an invasion, like a promise, like a threat. Rich, smoky, impossibly thick in the humid Louisiana morning. She had never smelled anything like it. Even in peacetime, Tokyo bacon had been a rumor, a luxury mentioned in whispered conversations about Western decadence. Now it filled her lungs with every breath. Beside her, 12 bunks away, Keiko sat rigid on her mattress. The young woman had not eaten in 3 days, had taken water only when Major Demoto ordered her to. Her face had grown gaunt, her eyes sunken, but her jaw remained set with the kind of determination that Machiko recognized from training. The determination that said suffering was virtue, that said hunger proves strength. "It is worse this morning," Keiko whispered in Japanese. "The smell." Yes, Machiko agreed. She had eaten, had forced down the chicken and potatoes and milk despite every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that accepting enemy kindness was a betrayal. But her body had made its own arguments. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her dizziness had faded. After 4 years of rationed rice and watery soup, her body recognized abundance and refused to reject it. 12 women had followed Keiko's lead. 12 women who sat at meals and stared at their plates but did not eat, who drank water but refused food, who believed that somewhere in their hunger was dignity. Major Demoto moved through the barracks checking on each woman. She paused at Keiko's bunk. "You need to eat." "I cannot, Major." "That is an order, not a suggestion." "With respect, Major, you cannot order me to become like them." Keiko's voice was steady despite her weakened state. "I will not let American food make me soft. Make me forget who I am." Demoto's expression flickered. For a moment, Machiko saw something terrible in the Major's eyes. Recognition. Because Demoto understood exactly what Keiko meant. Understood the fear that eating well while Japan starved was a kind of treachery. That accepting kindness from the enemy eroded something essential in the soul. "You are not becoming like them," Demoto said quietly. "You are surviving. There is no honor in starving yourself to death in a prison camp where the guards are begging you to eat. The guards should not care whether we eat or starve. But they do." Demoto sat down on the edge of the bunk. "That is the problem, is it not? They care. They bring food and worry when we refuse it. They treat us like human beings. And that is more terrifying than if they treated us like enemies." Keiko's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her hollow cheeks. "I do not know how to do this, Major. I do not know how to be a prisoner in a place that does not feel like a prison." None of them did. That was the truth sitting heavy in the barracks. They had prepared for cruelty, for violence, for the kind of treatment they knew Japanese soldiers sometimes gave to prisoners. Instead, they had found clean beds and hot showers and meals that arrived 3 times a day with mechanical regularity. The breakfast bell rang. The women filed toward the mess hall in silent procession. Machiko noticed the guards watching them with concern. Young men, most of them. Boys, really. 18, 19, 20 years old. Too young to have fought overseas. Too green to hide their worry when they saw the Japanese women growing thinner by the day. One guard, a corporal named James Mitchell, stood by the door. He was from Kansas, 22 years old. Machiko had learned this from Lieutenant Saito, who spoke with the guards in careful English. Corporal Mitchell had lost his brother at Iwo Jima, had requested duty at this camp specifically because he wanted to hate Japanese people, wanted to see the enemy up close and confirm everything he believed about them. But his eyes now held only concern. "Please," he said as the women passed, "please eat something today." No one answered. They filed inside and took their seats. The breakfast arrived on metal trays: scrambled eggs, 4 strips of bacon, toast with butter, a small bowl of fruit, coffee or milk, the same meal as yesterday, the same meal as the day before. Consistent, dependable, abundant. Keiko stared at her plate and did not move. Around the mess hall, American guards ate their own breakfast. Machiko watched them, watched how casually they consumed food that would feed a Japanese family for days. Watched how they talked while eating, laughed, complained about minor inconveniences. One guard grumbled that the coffee was not hot enough, another that he preferred his eggs over easy instead of scrambled. Such problems. Such tiny, meaningless problems. Lieutenant Saito leaned close to Machiko. Do you see how they waste nothing? Even when complaining, they eat every bite. That is the difference. They have so much that they can afford to want it cooked differently. Machiko picked up a strip of bacon, bit into it. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, smoke, fat that melted and coated her mouth with richness. She closed her eyes and understood finally what abundance meant. It meant having enough that you could make food taste good. Not just sustaining, good, pleasurable. In Japan, they had been taught that pleasure was weakness, that suffering built character, that going without made you stronger. But the Americans eating breakfast around her did not look weak. They looked healthy, strong, the kind of strong that came from being well-fed since birth, from never knowing hunger as a constant companion. Across the table, Keiko swayed slightly in her seat. Major Demoto stood immediately. Keiko, you need medical attention. I am fine. You are not fine. You are 3 days without food, and you will collapse. Then I collapse with honor. The mess hall had gone quiet. American guards were watching now. Corporal Mitchell approached the table. Is she okay? Saito translated. Demoto answered. The conversation went back and forth in halting English and Japanese. And then something unexpected happened. Corporal Mitchell sat down across from Keiko. He picked up his own plate, pushed it across the table to her. Here, he said. Saito translated. Take mine. If you do not want theirs, take mine. I will get another. Keiko stared at the plate, stared at this American boy who had lost a brother to Japanese bullets and was now offering her his breakfast. Quack quack, she whispered. Saito translated. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because my brother would not have wanted me to let someone starve, even an enemy, especially not a woman. That is not who we are. That is not who we are. The words hung in the air like a verdict, like a declaration, like a truth that cut deeper than any propaganda Keiko had ever been taught. She picked up a piece of toast, bit into it, chewed, swallowed. Then she began to cry, not quietly, not with dignity. She sobbed while she ate, great heaving woes that shook her thin shoulders. She ate the eggs and cried, ate the bacon and cried, drank the milk and cried until there was nothing left on the plate and nothing left in her tears. Corporal Mitchell stood and walked away without a word, but Machiko saw his hands shaking as he left, saw the way he wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. Later, Machiko would learn that he wrote a letter to his mother that night, wrote that he had come to Camp Livingston to hate Japanese people and instead found himself feeding them breakfast, wrote that he did not know what to do with that, did not know how to hold his brother's death and this morning's kindness in the same heart. His mother wrote back, told him that this was exactly what America was supposed to be, that kindness was not weakness, that feeding the hungry even when the hungry were yesterday's enemies was what separated them from the darkness. But on that morning in that mess hall, all Machiko knew was that something had shifted. 12 women who had refused food now ate, slowly, reluctantly, but they ate, and with each bite the empire's lies crumbled a little more. The morning after the hunger strike ended, the women were told they had visitors. Machiko felt her stomach clench. Visitors could mean interrogators, could mean officials from Tokyo, could mean anything. The women assembled in the yard standing in nervous rows while guards watched with their usual careful kindness. A truck rumbled through the gates. Out stepped Buck Harrison. Behind him, 2 more men climbed down from the truck bed. Even bigger than Buck, if such a thing was possible. Broad shoulders straining against plaid shirts, hands like dinner plates, axes slung across their backs with the casual ease of samurai carrying swords. The Morrison brothers. Jake Morrison stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. His brother Tom matched him inch for inch, pound for pound. They were 32 and 30 years old respectively, had been logging in Oregon since they were teenagers, had hands scarred from rope and wood, had faces weathered by sun and wind, had eyes that held the particular clarity of men who worked outdoors and slept well at night. Buck spoke with the camp commander, gestured toward the women. The commander nodded. Lieutenant Saito was called over to translate. "The guards want to show you something," she said to the assembled women. "They are taking us to the timber mill to watch the Americans work." Murmurs rippled through the group. Major Demoto frowned. "Why?" Saito spoke with Buck for a moment. "He says because we deserve to see what real American labor looks like. He says the propaganda lied about more than just cowboy hats." They were loaded into trucks, driven 3 miles down a dirt road that cut through endless pine forest. Louisiana stretched around them in shades of green that Tokyo had forgotten. Trees thick as temple columns, undergrowth lush and wild, the smell of earth and sap and growing things. The timber mill sat in a clearing, massive, industrial. The kind of operation that processed entire forests into lumber. For a nation that built houses like other countries built monuments. Constantly, endlessly, without ever seeming to run out of trees. The women were positioned at a safe distance, given seats on stumps and logs. The guards distributed water bottles, made sure everyone was comfortable, treated them like guests instead of prisoners. Then Jake and Tom Morrison went to work. They selected a pine tree, 90 feet tall, 3 feet in diameter at the base, the kind of tree that would have been sacred in Japan, protected, preserved. Here it was just lumber, just raw material for America's endless appetite for building. The brothers positioned themselves on opposite sides, lifted their axes, and began to swing. The sound was like thunder, like drum beats, like the rhythm of a heart that had never known weakness or doubt. Steel bit into wood, chips flew. The brothers worked in perfect synchronization. 1 swing, 2, 3. Their muscles flexed and released with mechanical precision. Sweat began to darken their shirts, but they were smiling. Machiko watched in stunned silence. This was not the desperate labor of men forced to work. This was not the exhausted stumbling of underfed soldiers pressed into service. This was something else entirely. This was craft, skill, pride in doing a job well. Beside her, Lieutenant Saito was counting under her breath. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. At the 7-minute mark, the tree groaned. At 8 minutes, it cracked. At 8 minutes and 42 seconds, it fell. 90 feet of ancient pine crashing to the earth with a sound like the end of the world. The Morrison brothers stepped back, wiped their brows, turned to each other, and grinned. Then Tom said something that made Jake laugh, loud, genuine. The kind of laugh that said this was just another Tuesday, just another tree. Nothing special. They had not even been breathing hard. Major Damato stood slowly, walked toward the fallen tree as if in a trance, placed her hand on the trunk. It was still warm from the friction of the saw and axe, still bleeding sap. "Impossible," she whispered in Japanese. But it was not impossible. It was simply American. The guards allowed the women to approach, to touch the tree, to see the precision of the cuts. Jake Morrison knelt down and showed them through gestures how the grain of the wood determined where to strike, how experience taught you to read a tree like a book, how strength mattered but technique mattered more. Tom Morrison pulled out a pocket watch, showed it to Lieutenant Saito. 8 minutes 40 seconds, he said in English. "Not our best time. Could have done it in 7 if the grain had been better." Saito translated. The women stared. "Could have done it in 7 minutes." As if felling a 90-foot tree in under 10 minutes was somehow disappointing. As if this display of power and skill was just barely adequate. One of the Japanese women, a clerk named Yuki, asked a question through Saito. "How long have you been doing this work?" Tom smiled. "Since I was 15. So 15 years now." "And in Japan," Yuki continued slowly, "how much would someone doing this work be paid?" Tom shrugged. "I make about $2 an hour. Work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Sometimes 6 if we have a big order." Saito did not translate the numbers at first. She was doing math in her head, converting dollars to yen, calculating what $2 an hour meant compared to what a Japanese laborer made. When she finally spoke the numbers in Japanese, several women gasped. "That cannot be right," someone said. "It is right," Saito replied. "An American lumberjack makes more in one day than a Japanese factory worker makes in a week." The silence that followed was profound, because suddenly it was not just about the tree. It was about the fundamental mathematics of the war. Japan had sent soldiers with empty bellies and threadbare uniforms against a nation that paid its lumberjacks enough to own homes, to feed families, to have money left over for entertainment and comfort. Buck Harrison approached Major Demoto, held out his hand. In it sat a small piece of wood, carved, delicate, the shape of a horse in mid-gallop. "Tom made this during lunch yesterday," Buck said through Saito's translation. "He wanted to give it to one of you as a gift." Demoto took the carving, turned it over in her hands. The detail was extraordinary. Muscles, mane, eyes that seemed almost alive. The kind of work that required time and patience, and most importantly, the energy that comes from being well-fed and well-rested. "He makes these for fun?" Demoto asked. "Yes, ma'am, sometimes sells them at the county fair, but mostly just makes them because he likes it." Likes it. The concept seemed alien. Men who worked hard all day and then created art in their spare time because they liked it, because they had energy left over after labor, because abundance meant you could spend time on things that were not strictly necessary for survival. The truck ride back to camp was silent, each woman lost in her own calculations, her own realizations. The mathematics of empire versus the mathematics of prosperity. The cost of ideology versus the profit of pragmatism. That night, Major Demoto began her notebook. She sat on her bunk with a pencil and paper she had requested from the guards. They had provided it without question. Of course they had. Paper was abundant here. Pencils were cheap. Everything was abundant. She wrote in precise characters, measurements, observations, facts. American prisoner breakfast, 800 calories minimum. Japanese soldier daily ration, 600 calories maximum. American lumberjack wages, $16 per week. Japanese factory worker wages 8 yen per week. Exchange rate makes this a ratio of 12 to 1. Time to fell 90-foot pine tree. Under 9 minutes with 2 men. Japanese equivalent would require 10 men and 40 minutes. On and on she wrote, page after page of data. Evidence. Proof that the war had been lost before it started. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage. Not because the emperor had failed them. But because you cannot defeat a nation that feeds its prisoners better than you feed your soldiers. Cannot outproduce a country that pays lumberjacks more than you pay generals. Cannot outlast an economy that treats abundance as the baseline instead of the aspiration. Other women gathered around her bunk, read over her shoulder, added their own observations. "The milk," someone said. "They gave us milk again today. In Japan, milk is for sick children only. Here they give it to prisoners." "The guards' uniforms," another added. "New, well-fitted, no patches. No repairs. How many uniforms does each guard have?" "The trucks," Lieutenant Saito said. "Did you count the trucks today? I counted 14 just on our drive to the mill. All working, all maintained. In Japan, we have perhaps 3 working trucks in an entire district." The notebook grew, a catalog of American abundance, a ledger of Japanese miscalculation. But more than that, it became a plan, because Major Demoto was not just recording defeat. She was studying victory, was learning the lessons that Japan would need if it ever hoped to rise from the ashes, was understanding that the future would not be built on sacrifice and suffering, but on productivity and plenty. "We have to tell them," she said finally. "When we return to Japan, we have to tell everyone what we have seen." "They will not believe us," Keiko said. The young woman who had starved herself now sat among the others, her face still gaunt, but her eyes bright. "They will call us traitors, collaborators." "Perhaps," Demoto agreed, "but we still have to try." In her pocket, Machiko still carried the apple. 4 days now. She had not eaten it, could not bring herself to cross that final threshold. But that night after the notebook session, after watching her companions transform from prisoners into students, she took it out, held it in both hands, thought about Buck Harrison handing it to her. "You look hungry, ma'am." Such simple words, such devastating kindness. She bit into the apple. It was sweet, crisp. The juice ran down her chin. She had never tasted anything so good. Not because the apple was special, but because it represented something larger than fruit. It represented the moment she chose to see the truth instead of the lie, chose reality over propaganda, chose to believe her eyes instead of her indoctrination. Around her, the other women watched. Some nodded, some wept. Understood. They had come to this camp as prisoners of war. But they were leaving as something else, something more dangerous to the empire's mythology than any army could ever be. They were leaving as witnesses to abundance. And no wall, no propaganda, no amount of nationalism could stand against the simple truth they now carried. America was real, the cowboys existed, the lumberjacks were not myths. And Japan had picked a fight with giants while calling them mice. Week 2 at Camp Livingston began with rain. Not the gentle mist that sometimes graced Tokyo mornings, not the respectful drizzle that knew its place. This was Louisiana rain, heavy, relentless, the kind that turned the compound yard into a sea of red mud and made the pine trees smell like they were bleeding sap. The kind that drummed on the barracks roof like 10,000 fingers tapping out a rhythm that said, "You are far from home. You are far from everything you knew." Machiko stood at the window watching water sheet down the glass. Behind her, Major Demoto sat at the small desk that the guards had provided without being asked. More abundance, more casual generosity. The desk was sturdy, real wood, not scrap or salvage, just furniture, given to a prisoner because she had mentioned wanting a flat surface to write on. The notebook lay open before Demoto. 7 days of entries now, 23 pages of precise handwriting documenting everything. Food portions measured in grams, calorie counts estimated from years of military training, observations about machinery, about clothing quality, about the casual waste that Americans did not even recognize as waste. "Come here," Demoto said without looking up. "I need your eyes." Machiko crossed the room, sat beside the major, looked at the newest entry. "Transportation infrastructure," Demoto read aloud. "Yesterday I counted 27 trucks entering and leaving this camp. 27 in one day. Each truck appears to be less than 5 years old, well maintained. Tires in good condition. This suggests a manufacturing capacity that," she paused, tapped her pencil against the page. "Machiko, how many working trucks did your hospital have in Manila before we were captured?" "2," Machiko said quietly. "One was from 1935. The other we had repaired so many times that the mechanics joked it was more patches than original parts." Demoto wrote this down. "And those trucks served how many people?" "The hospital had 300 beds, plus staff, plus the surrounding military installations that depended on our supply chains." More notes, more calculations. Demoto's handwriting remained steady, but Machiko could see the tension in her shoulders, could see how each new entry, each new piece of evidence built toward a conclusion that was becoming harder to deny. Japan had never stood a chance, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, not because the emperor had failed to inspire, but because you cannot will your way past mathematics, cannot outspirit industrial capacity, cannot defeat a nation that treats abundance as mundane while you treat scarcity as virtue. "Major," Machiko said slowly, "what are you planning to do with this notebook?" For the first time, Demoto looked up. Her eyes held something Machiko had never seen there before. Not quite hope, not quite despair, something in between, something that looked like terrible clarity. "When we return to Japan," Demoto said, "assuming we return to Japan, someone needs to tell them the truth, not propaganda, not face-saving excuses. The truth, that we lost because we were fighting a country that has more trucks in one prison camp than we have in an entire prefecture. They will not want to hear that. No, they will hate me for saying it, will call me a traitor, a collaborator. But Machiko," Damoto's voice dropped to almost a whisper, "what if this notebook could help rebuild? What if instead of making the same mistakes, Japan could learn from what we see here, could study how America creates this abundance and apply those lessons? The idea hung in the humid air between them. Seditious, dangerous, also possibly brilliant. That is a nice thought, Major. But how would this notebook even reach the right people? We are prisoners. They will search us, confiscate anything we try to take back. Demoto smiled, small, tight, the smile of someone who had already thought 3 moves ahead. Which is why we will not take the notebook back. We will leave it here, with people we trust. And when the occupation happens, when American forces enter Tokyo, they will bring it to the right Japanese officials, the ones trying to rebuild, the ones who need to understand why we lost and how to ensure we never repeat those mistakes. Before Machiko could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Lieutenant Saito entered, shaking rain from her hair. The guards say there will be a special session this afternoon. In the mess hall, they are calling it English lessons. Machiko and Demoto exchanged glances. English lessons, Demoto repeated. Why? They say if we are going to be here for weeks or months, we should be able to communicate better. That it will make everything easier. Saito paused. Also, they have arranged for a guest instructor, someone from the local community who volunteered. A civilian, Demoto's military instincts flared. Is that permitted? Apparently everything is permitted here, Saito said dryly. Have you noticed they have no real restrictions on us? No punishment for speaking Japanese. No forced labor. They treat us like we are at a particularly strict boarding school rather than a prison camp. It was true, the rules at Camp Livingston were minimal. Stay within the compound, attend roll call, eat meals at designated times. Beyond that, the women had remarkable freedom, could move about the barracks, could gather and talk, could request books, paper, even the small luxuries. It was unsettling. Prison was supposed to involve suffering. This involved boredom more than hardship. The afternoon brought 63 women into the mess hall. Rain continued its assault outside. Inside, the guards had arranged chairs in a semicircle. At the front stood a small chalkboard on an easel, and beside it a man in his late 60s wearing suspenders and a weathered smile. Good afternoon, ladies, he said in slow, clear English. My name is Henry Thompson. I taught school in this parish for 40 years before I retired. When the camp commander asked if anyone would volunteer to help you learn English well, he smiled wider. I figured teaching beats fishing in the rain. Lieutenant Saito translated haltingly. Some of the women who had studied English in school laughed at the joke. Others simply stared with the blank incomprehension of people who had been taught to fear Americans and were now confronted with a grandfatherly figure making jokes about fishing. Mr. Thompson began with simple words. Hello, goodbye, please, thank you. He wrote them on the chalkboard in careful letters, had the women repeat them, corrected pronunciation with gentle patience. Now, he said, after 20 minutes of basics, I know learning a new language can be intimidating, so I brought someone to help, someone who knows a thing or two about making folks comfortable. The door opened. Buck Harrison walked in. Machiko felt her breath catch. Around her, other women sat straighter, whispered to each other. The cowboy who had tipped his hat, the man who had lifted the impossible crate, the living refutation of every lie they had been taught. Buck removed his hat, held it in both hands, nodded respectfully to the assembled women. Ma'am, Mr. Thompson said to Saito, could you translate for me? I want to make sure everyone understands. What followed was one of the strangest hours of Machiko's life. Buck Harrison, cowboy and delivery man, in walking contradiction, became their English teacher. Not through grammar and syntax, but through demonstration, through acting out words with his whole body in ways that made their meanings unmistakable. When teaching the word lift, he picked up in a chair with one hand. The women laughed nervously. When teaching gentle, he held a coffee cup like it was made of spider silk, made a show of setting it down with exaggerated care. When teaching friend, he walked to Machiko's chair, extended his hand for a handshake. She stared at that hand, calloused, strong, the hand of a man who worked for a living, the hand that had tipped a hat to her, that had handed her an apple, that was now being offered in friendship. Around her, the other women watched, waiting. This moment mattered in ways Machiko could not fully articulate. This was not just about shaking hands. This was about accepting that the enemy could be kind, that propaganda could be wrong, that everything they had built their identity around for the past 4 years might be sand instead of stone. Machiko took Buck's hand. His palm engulfed hers completely. Warm, rough, gentle despite the obvious strength. He shook once firmly, then released. Friend, he said clearly. Friend, Machiko repeated. The English word felt strange in her mouth. Foreign, also somehow right. Buck smiled, the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, the kind that was impossible to fake. Then he moved on to the next woman, offered the same handshake, the same word, the same simple gesture of common humanity. One by one, the Japanese women shook hands with an American cowboy. Some cried while doing it. Some laughed. Some remained stone-faced, shaking out of obligation rather than acceptance. But they all shook. All participated in this small ritual that acknowledged something fundamental. They were not just prisoners and guards. They were people, on opposite sides of a war that had ended, but still people. After the handshakes, Mr. Thompson taught them a song, You Are My Sunshine. Simple, melodic, the kind of song that American children learned before they could write. He sang it once through in his reedy old voice, then had Buck sing it. Buck's voice was deep, rough around the edges, not trained or polished, but honest. He sang about sunshine and happiness and please don't take my sunshine away. Some of the women who understood English translated quietly for the others. The lyrics were simple, almost childish. But there was something in the earnestness of Buck's delivery that made it feel like more than a children's song, made it feel like a statement of philosophy, a declaration that happiness mattered, that sunshine was worth singing about, that hope was not weakness. By the end of the session, 63 Japanese women were humming You Are My Sunshine in broken English, while rain pounded the roof and an old school teacher and a cowboy grinned at each other like they had just won a small but significant victory. That night, the fracture in the barracks widened. Not all the women had embraced the English lesson. A group of 7, led by a nurse named Tomoko, refused to participate, sat in the back with arms crossed and faces set. When the others hummed You Are My Sunshine before bed, Tomoko stood up. This is shameful, she said in Japanese. Her voice cut through the drowsy warmth of the barracks. We are Japanese. We are prisoners of war. And you are singing American children's songs like we are at some kind of summer camp. Major Demoto looked up from her notebook. We are learning to communicate with our captors. That is practical, not shameful. Is it practical to shake hands with the enemy, to smile at cowboys, to eat their food and wear their clothes and accept their kindness like we are guests instead of prisoners? The question silenced the barracks, because it was the question they had all been wrestling with. The question that kept Machiko awake some nights. Where was the line between survival and collaboration, between learning and betraying? I will tell you what I think, came a new voice. Lieutenant Saito stood. At 29, she was not the oldest woman in the camp, but she carried authority that came from education, from having lived in America before, from speaking both languages and understanding both cultures in ways the others could not. I think, Saito continued, that we have a choice. We can spend our time here clinging to propaganda that has already been proven false, or we can open our eyes and learn. Learn how they create this abundance. Learn how they build a nation that can fight a war on 2 fronts while feeding prisoners chicken dinners. Learn the lessons that Japan will desperately need if it ever hopes to rebuild. That sounds like you want us to become American, Tomoko shot back. No, Sato's voice was firm. I want us to become Japanese who understand why we lost. There is a difference, a crucial difference. Major Demoto stood now too, the 2 ranking officers facing down the dissenters. Machiko felt the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. I have been keeping this notebook, Demoto said. She held it up. Every day I record what we see, what we learn, facts, data, evidence, and every day the conclusion becomes clearer. We did not lose because we lacked spirit. We lost because we were fighting a nation that has more resources in 1 parish than we have in 10 prefectures. So we should admire our conquerors. Tomoko's voice dripped with contempt. We should learn from them. Damoto's eyes blazed with an intensity Machiko had never seen. Because if we return to Japan and tell them only what they want to hear, only stories that preserve their pride, then we will have wasted this opportunity. We will rebuild on the same lies that led to this disaster. And what opportunity is that, Major? The opportunity to betray our people. The opportunity to save them. The words rang out like a gunshot. Damoto was breathing hard now, her military composure cracking under the weight of conviction. Listen to me, all of you. When we return to Japan, it will be destroyed. Cities burned, industries shattered, millions dead or starving. And the people who are left will be desperate for answers, will want to know why, how, what went wrong. We can tell them it was bad luck, divine will, insufficient spirit, all the comfortable lies that let them avoid facing the truth. Damoto paused, looked around the barracks at each woman in turn. Or we can tell them the truth, that we fought a nation of cowboys and lumberjacks who eat bacon for breakfast and make wood carvings for fun. That we challenged an industrial power that treats abundance as normal and kindness as strength. That we lost not because we were weak, but because we never understood how strong they were. Silence fell like a hammer. Then Machiko stood. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. I choose to see, she said quietly, even if it destroys everything I thought I knew. Even if they call me a traitor. I choose to see the truth and carry it home. One by one other women stood. Lieutenant Saito, then Keiko, the young woman who had starved herself before learning to eat. Then others, 15, 20, 30, more than half the barracks on their feet, choosing to see, choosing to learn, choosing to become witnesses instead of victims. Tomoko and her 6 supporters remained seated, remained committed to their beliefs, to the comfortable narrative that preserved pride even as it blinded them to reality. The barracks divided that night, not with violence, not with hatred, but with a quiet, fundamental split between those who could accept that they had been lied to and those who could not. Major Damoto sat back down at her desk, opened her notebook, began to write. Today we learned that friendship can exist between enemies, that a cowboy will shake your hand and mean it, that Americans teach their children to sing about sunshine. These small things matter, not because they change the past, but because they show us what the future could be if we are brave enough to build it on truth instead of lies. Outside, the rain continued, washing the compound clean, filling the air with the smell of wet pine and red earth, the smell of Louisiana, the smell of a place none of them had chosen to be, but all of them would remember. Machiko lay in her bunk that night thinking about Buck Harrison's hand, about how gentle it had been despite its strength, about how that gentleness was possible only because he had never known hunger, had never known scarcity, had grown up in a world where abundance allowed you to be kind because kindness cost you nothing. That was the lesson, she thought. Not that Americans were superior, but that abundance created the conditions for kindness. That prosperity allowed generosity. That you could not build a compassionate society on empty stomachs and nationalist fervor. Japan would need to learn this, would need to understand that strength came not from suffering, but from sufficiency, not from sacrifice, but from productivity. And she would tell them, would stand before whoever would listen and describe Buck Harrison shaking her hand, would explain that the bacon was real, that the cowboys existed, that everything they had been taught was a carefully constructed lie designed to make them accept poverty as virtue. She would tell them even if they hated her for it, even if they called her a collaborator, a traitor, an American sympathizer, because Major Damoto was right. The truth was the only foundation worth building on. And the truth was that America had won not through bombs alone, but through bacon and handshakes and songs about sunshine. 3,000 miles away in a Tokyo still smoldering from firebombs, officials were already planning Japan's surrender. Were already drafting documents, negotiating terms, preparing their people for occupation and reconstruction. None of them knew about Camp Livingston, about 63 women keeping notebooks and learning English and shaking hands with cowboys. None of them knew that the most important lessons about rebuilding Japan were being learned not in government offices, but in a Louisiana prison camp where the guards served bacon for breakfast and taught prisoners to sing. But they would learn, eventually. When the women returned with their impossible stories in their meticulous notebooks and their first-hand accounts of American abundance, they would learn that the war had been lost not at Midway or Guadalcanal or Hiroshima, but the moment Japan declared war on a nation that had so much it could afford to be kind to its enemies. That was the truth, and truth once seen could not be unseen. The weeks that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm of captivity and education. October gave way to November. The Louisiana heat broke into something almost pleasant. The women settled into routines that felt less like imprisonment and more like an uncomfortable residency in a foreign land that refused to match their expectations. Major Demoto's notebook grew thicker, 30 pages, 40, 50. A complete catalog of American abundance documented with the precision of a military logistics officer who understood that these observations might be the most important intelligence Japan would receive about its conqueror. But intelligence was not the right word anymore. These were not spy reports. They were lesson plans, blueprints for rebuilding, evidence that prosperity could be studied, replicated, learned. On a Thursday in late November, the camp commander made an announcement. The Japanese women would be permitted to observe the American holiday of Thanksgiving, not as participants exactly, but as witnesses, as students of a culture that celebrated gratitude and abundance with a feast. Machiko stood with the other women in the mess hall watching American guards and their families gather, watching tables groan under the weight of food that seemed impossible. Turkey, 3 turkeys, each one larger than any bird Machiko had seen in her life. Stuffing, mashed potatoes in quantities that could feed a village. Cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls, pies, apple and pumpkin and pecan. Lieutenant Saito whispered the translations, explained each dish, but words could not capture what they were seeing. This was not a feast for generals or emperors. This was Thursday dinner for ordinary Americans, guards who earned modest wages, families from nearby towns, common people celebrating abundance as if it were their birthright. Because it was. One of the guards, a young man named Robert, whose wife had just given birth, approached Major Demoto. Through Lieutenant Saito, he said, "Ma'am, we'd be honored if you and your ladies would join us for a plate. There's more than enough. There's always more than enough. There's always more than enough." The women accepted. How could they not? And as Machiko sat with a plate of Thanksgiving dinner in front of her, she understood something fundamental about American power. It was not just industrial capacity or military might. It was this: the casual expectation of plenty, the cultural assumption that there would always be more, that scarcity was a problem to be solved, not a virtue to be celebrated. Japan had built an empire on the beauty of restraint, on making do with less, on finding honor in deprivation. America had built a nation on the promise of more. Only one of those philosophies could win a modern war. Machiko ate turkey and thought about her mother in Osaka, wondered if she was alive, if she had food, if she understood yet that the war was truly over. And she made a promise to herself. When she returned, she would tell her mother about this Thanksgiving, would describe the abundance not to hurt her, but to show her what was possible, what Japan could become if it stopped worshiping scarcity and started building prosperity. December brought news of repatriation. Ships were being arranged. The women would return to Japan in stages. Early in the new year, February at the latest, the announcement created panic in some, relief in others. Major Demoto called a meeting of the women who had been keeping notes and asking questions, learning. "We have perhaps 2 months left," she said. 2 months to learn everything we can, to ask every question, to understand how they do this so that we can teach Japan to do the same. The pace of learning intensified. The women asked the guards about everything. How much did a house cost? How did banking work? What was a mortgage? How did farmers get loans? What was crop insurance? How did schools function? Why did children stay in school until 18 instead of going to work at 12? The guards answered patiently. Sometimes brought in civilians who knew more. A banker, a farmer, a teacher, a factory manager who had moved to Louisiana from Detroit. Each answer was another piece of the puzzle, another insight into how America had built this abundance. It was not magic. It was not racial superiority. It was systems, infrastructure, investment in education, access to capital, government support for agriculture and industry, a culture that rewarded innovation and risk-taking. All things Japan could replicate if it had the courage to try. On Christmas, the guards decorated the mess hall, put up a tree, strung lights, sang carols, and again invited the Japanese women to observe to participate if they wished. Buck Harrison played Santa Claus, wore a red suit that was slightly too small for his frame, handed out small gifts to the children of guards and staff. Then almost shyly he handed wrapped packages to each of the Japanese women. Machiko opened hers to find a book, English primer, with a note inside in careful handwriting. For when you go home and teach others, your friend Buck. Your friend, she looked up to find him watching her. He tipped his hat. That same gesture that had shattered her world 3 months ago. Except now it did not feel like a weapon. It felt like a benediction, like a promise that maybe possibly former enemies could become something else. She bowed, deep, formal, the kind of bow reserved for teachers and honored elders. When she straightened, Buck was smiling. January 1946 brought the final preparations. The women were given new clothes for the journey home. Clean, well-made, American dresses and coats that would mark them immediately as having been in American custody, as having been treated well. Some of the women worried about this. They will hate us for looking healthy, one said. Major Demoto disagreed. Let them see. Let them understand that even prisoners were treated better here than soldiers were treated at home. It is part of the truth we carry back. The notebook was entrusted to Buck Harrison. He would keep it safe, he promised, would ensure it reached the right people during the occupation, would make certain that Major Demoto's meticulous observations made their way to Japanese officials tasked with rebuilding. On the last day, the women gathered in the compound yard, the same yard where Machiko had first seen Buck lift that impossible crate, where her education in American abundance had begun. The guards lined up to say goodbye. Corporal Mitchell, who had fed Keiko breakfast when she was starving herself. The Morrison brothers, who had shown them that labor could be joyful. Mr. Thompson, who had taught them that learning was a gift. And Buck Harrison, who had tipped his hat and called them friends and meant it. One by one, the women shook hands, said goodbye in broken English, promised to remember. Buck approached Machiko last. You take care, ma'am, he said. You tell them the truth. You build something good. I will try, Machiko replied in careful English. Thank you for everything. Just being neighborly, Buck said with that easy smile. That is what we do. The ship that carried them back across the Pacific was crowded with repatriated civilians and prisoners. Machiko stood on deck, watching Louisiana disappear behind them, and wondered if anyone would believe what she had seen. The arrival in Japan answered that question immediately. Yokohama was a wasteland, buildings reduced to rubble, people in rags, children with hollow eyes and distended bellies. The smell of ash and desperation hung in the air like fog. Machiko's group was processed through a reception center. Officials from the new government interviewed each woman, asked about their treatment, their captivity. When Machiko tried to explain about the abundance, about the lessons about what Japan could learn, the official cut her off. You were treated well because Americans wanted to use you for propaganda, he said dismissively. Do not mistake their calculation for kindness. But Machiko had seen kindness, real kindness, the kind that cost nothing because the givers had so much, and she refused to let cynicism erase that truth. She found her mother in Osaka, or what was left of Osaka. Her mother was 52 but looked 70, gaunt, wrapped in a threadbare coat that had once been elegant. They wept when they saw each other, held each other, and then Machiko did something that would define the rest of her life. She gave her mother the American coat she had been given at Camp Livingston. Where did you get this? Her mother asked, touching the wool as if it were gold. From the Americans who held me prisoner, Machiko said. And before you ask, yes, they treated us well. Better than well, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure Japan learns why. Over the next months, Machiko found work at a hospital that was struggling to rebuild. Found the other women from Camp Livingston. Together, they began to teach. Not officially at first, just conversations. Explanations to colleagues about what they had seen. Suggestions about American methods. Major Demoto's notebook reached Tokyo through occupation channels just as Buck had promised. It made its way to officials tasked with rebuilding Japan's industrial capacity. Some dismissed it, others read it carefully and began to ask questions. By 1950, a pattern had emerged. The women who had been prisoners at Camp Livingston were becoming influential in their fields. Machiko supervised nursing staff and introduced American hygiene protocols. Lieutenant Saito worked with occupation forces as a translator and cultural liaison. Others moved into education, agriculture, manufacturing. They met monthly, called themselves half-jokingly the Sunshine Circle, because they had learned to sing about sunshine in Louisiana and had brought that philosophy home. The belief that happiness mattered, that abundance was achievable, that prosperity was not a betrayal of Japanese values but an evolution of them. The decades passed, Japan rebuilt, rose, became an economic power that stunned the world. And while the miracle had many fathers, there were quiet voices who remembered that some of the earliest lessons had come from 63 women who had been prisoners in Louisiana and had chosen to see instead of remaining blind. In 1990, Machiko received an invitation, a reunion. Camp Livingston was being preserved as a historical site. Some of the former guards were still alive. Would she come? She was 69 years old, a grandmother, a respected hospital administrator, a woman who had spent 45 years teaching Japanese nurses that cleanliness saved lives and abundance enabled kindness. She went. Buck Harrison was there, 72 years old, still tall, though stooped now, still wearing a cowboy hat, though his hands shook when he tipped it. They stood in the compound yard, now overgrown, quiet. A memorial plaque explained what had happened here, how Japanese prisoners had been held, how they had been treated with dignity, how some had returned to Japan and helped rebuild. "You did it," Buck said. His voice was rougher, but still kind. "I heard about Japan, about the miracle. You told them, didn't you? You told them the truth." "I tried," Machiko said. "Some listened. Enough listened." "That's all we can ask for," Buck replied, "for enough people to listen." They walked through the old barracks, now empty. She showed him where she had slept, where Major Demoto had written the notebook, where Keiko had finally eaten after 3 days of refusing. "Do you ever regret it?" Buck asked. "Going back. Trying to teach them must have been hard." "Of course it was hard," Machiko said. "They called me a traitor, a collaborator, an American sympathizer." "But Buck," she paused, looked at this old cowboy who had tipped his hat to an enemy and changed her life. "You taught me that kindness is not weakness, that abundance defeats scarcity, that the truth matters more than comfort. How could I regret carrying that message home?" Buck smiled, reached into his pocket, pulled out something small, wooden, worn smooth by decades of handling. The carved horse, the one Tom Morrison had given to Major Demoto. "She sent this back to me," Buck admitted, "after the notebook made it to Tokyo, said to keep it safe, said maybe someday you'd all come back and I could return it to you." Machiko took the carving, turned it over in her hands. The detail was still extraordinary even after all these years. "Major Demoto died in 1978, Machiko said quietly. She was teaching agricultural economics at the University of Tokyo. Her last lecture was about American farming techniques, about how productivity enables generosity. She was a good woman," Buck said. "You all are, coming here scared and angry and choosing to learn instead of hate. That takes courage." "You made it easy," Machiko replied. "You were kind when you did not have to be. You taught us when you could have just guarded us. You treated us like people when we were supposed to be enemies." "That's just America," Buck said with a shrug, "or at least the America I believe in. The one that feeds people and tips hats and means it when we say friend." They stood in silence for a moment, two old people remembering a strange autumn when the world shifted, when propaganda met reality, when abundance taught lessons that bombs never could. "Thank you," Machiko said finally, "for the bacon, for the kindness, for being real." Buck tipped his hat one last time. "Thank you for seeing, for telling the truth, for building something good from something terrible." Machiko returned to Tokyo carrying the wooden horse. She placed it in her office at the hospital, and when young nurses asked about it, she told them the story. And some learned, and the lesson spread, and some learned, and the lesson spread. Buck Harrison died in 2005, 87 years old. His obituary mentioned his service as a guard at Camp Livingston, mentioned that some of the Japanese women he had guarded had attended his funeral, had flown from Japan to say goodbye to the cowboy who had taught them that myths could be real and enemies could be friends. Machiko lived to be 91, died in 2012 surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who lived in a Japan that bore almost no resemblance to the one she had been born into. A Japan that was prosperous, abundant, kind in ways that only plenty could enable. At her funeral, her granddaughter read a letter, written years before, addressed to Buck Harrison, though he had already passed. "Dear Buck," it began, "you taught me that myths can be real, that enemies can become teachers, that a cowboy tipping his hat can defeat an empire's propaganda. American men were not myths. They were flesh and bone, sweat and laughter, cowboys and lumberjacks. And by witnessing you, we discovered not only why Japan lost the war, but how we would rise again. Thank you for the bacon. Thank you for the kindness. Thank you for being real. With gratitude, always, Machiko." The letter ended. The granddaughter folded it carefully, placed it in the casket along with two items: the English primer Buck had given Machiko at Christmas 1945, and the wooden horse carved by a lumberjack who had energy left over after a long day's work because he had been well-fed his entire life. The America that won World War II was not just the America of ships and planes and industrial might. It was the America of bacon for breakfast and cowboys who tipped their hats. The America that fed its enemies and called them friends. The America that treated abundance as normal and kindness as strength. That was the America that changed the world. Not through conquest, but through example. Not through force, but through generosity. Not through bombs alone, but through the simple, devastating power of proving that prosperity was possible. That scarcity was a choice, not a destiny. That the future belonged to those brave enough to believe in abundance. And 63 Japanese women carried that message home, planted it, nurtured it, watched it grow into an economic miracle that reshaped Asia and astonished the world. All because a cowboy tipped his hat, because lumberjacks felled trees laughing, because guards served bacon for breakfast and meant it when they offered friendship. That is the America worth remembering. That is the America worth preserving. That is the America that won not just the war, but the peace that followed. And the truth once seen can never be unseen.